Well, good afternoon or good evening, as you will. We come to session 2 of this course, but we laid so many foundation stones for the whole course last time. I'm going to do a very brief recap before we go on. We began with the map, with the 3 empires. They were the Sumerian Empire of the Fertile Crescent, around Babylon, the Egyptian Empire with Memphis and Thebes, and the Hittite Empire of Anatolia in modern-day Turkey, and its capital at ancient Hattusha. Their meeting point, if you remember, was the great trading centre of Ugarit in the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean Sea, where the Raj Shamra tablets were found in the excavations of 1929. These gave us the earliest known phonetic alphabet, which in Israel became the Hebrew writing of the Jewish books. But I omitted to tell you last time, when I talk about the Jewish books, I mean not only what we have in the Old Testament, but also the books of the Apocrypha. And why the difference? Well, you have to ask Martin Luther about that. He gave us a much shorter list of books for the Old Testament, and because he was the head of the Reformation, all the Puritan churches since then have followed his lead. So the Bible Society, by its charter, is only allowed to print the Martin Luther list of books and call it the Old Testament. But in fact, there are some very important books in the Apocrypha, and I shall incorporate those into this course. Well, the first known evidence of religious awareness in ancient people's minds is the evidence of life after death. And we've realized that because of the relics or the things that have been buried with people in the long distance past. We're told the first evidence of this came at the time of the Neanderthal man in Europe. And this awareness of life after death came through dreams. And people got up from sleep and told people where they had been while they were asleep. Their families laughed. And it became known as the dream world. But when they finally went to sleep and died, the family thought, oh, they've gone to the dream world and will stay there forever. So they packed up things that the person might need in the dream world to carry on life as before. So that's the earliest evidence that we have of religious awareness in the animal called human beings. And the treasures we've found since, well, I showed you a lot from the royal tombs at Ur, near the Persian Gulf. And I'm sure you're familiar with all the treasures that have come from the tomb of Tutankhamun in Egypt and all the other pharaohs. So this would be a familiar thing for you. But as time went by, people began to worship a lot of gods under an umbrella term of El, a capital E and a capital L. That means God. And if you can think of El Al Airways, the Israeli airway, they've incorporated into their mojo. Well, every city centre in the ancient world, as at Ur, worshipped their own city god. If you remember, at Ur, it was the god Nana. Sounds feminine, but it was a he. Nana, the god of the moon. And of course, that was a great asset to all shepherds who much preferred to move their flocks and herds by night, by the light of the moon, instead of in the heat of the day. So Nana at Ur. And farmers, as they began to develop, lived in villages. They worshipped fertility gods to ensure they had good crops, young sheep, and children to inherit. And in addition to all this, every family worshipped their own family god, a spirit god, which they believed would protect their homes, their herds, and their children, wherever they lived or travelled. The The spirit was housed in a pottery jar called a teraph. Do you remember it had holes for its eyes and mouth? But they could take it wherever they went on their travels. If you go to modern Thailand, you'll find just the same setup there. Every family has a little house outside their front door where their spirit god lives. And they feed it, they take fresh flowers every day, just like the Hindus do and the Sikhs do in their own homes. So this is something that has not died out over the course of time. Well, our story began in Ur with the family of Tira, who migrated from Ur round the northernmost part of the Fertile Crescent. This is a black and white map, but it's in that sort of curve from the Persian Gulf round to the Mediterranean Sea. And they settled at Haran because it was another moon city, and they felt at home there. And eventually, when Terah died, his son Abraham inherited the tribe and the care of the Teraph, and now known as the God of Abraham, inverted commas. And in Genesis chapter 15, verse 1, that is translated as Abraham's shield. So the shield of Abraham is the God of Abraham. Their wanderings began again all through Canaan and southwards down the Mediterranean coast, which was then ruled by the Hittites from Anatolia. They went to Egypt for a while, but soon came back and settled in the south of that Mediterranean strip at Hebron. There, Abraham's son Isaac was born, a promise or covenant from his God, sealed with the mark of circumcision, that his descendants would own the whole land. This is still the mark of all Jews and Muslims, but not of Christians, thanks to St. Paul, who substituted the baptismal cross instead. And many years ago, when I was a younger curate, I was asked to baptize 3 brothers, one aged 5, one aged 8, and one aged 10. The 8-year-old asked me, could I please put the cross on his forehead in permanent red ink, and then he'd be able to show his teacher on Monday morning. Well, Abraham took a bold new step. He bought a cave in a field in order to bury his wife Sarah, a place still venerated today at Hebron, and he began to be a landowner. We covered a lot of other vital issues last time, and now we can get on to Isaac. Sadly, there's a dearth of stories about Isaac when compared with Abraham and Jacob. Tribal stories are always local to their area. Abraham's at Hebron, Jacob's at Bethel, and Isaac's at Beersheba. If I can work this. No. No. There you are. There's a map of Canaan. Can you see my pointer if I use it? No. Can you see the Dead Sea halfway down the map, the blob of blue? That's always my marker when I look at this map. At the southern end, to the left, is Beersheba. Halfway up the Dead Sea, and on the left, you get to Hebron. At the top of the Dead Sea, you get to Jerusalem, and a little bit above that on the left, you get Bethel. So those are the 3 centers belonging to the 3 patriarchs. Isaac built an altar at Beersheba and dug a well, so that became his center. What about those stories then? Did they ever exist, or have they been lost? We don't know. But we do read in Genesis 32 that his family god was the fear of the Lord. Different from Abraham's shield. So were these quite different tribes altogether? Different tribes whose stories have been woven together into a seamless family saga by the later storytellers, taking in the Jacob stories at Bethel as well. Well, these are the questions we have to bear in mind from now on. I'll get rid of this map. Isaac remains a shadowy figure, a passive victim, if you remember, when his father nearly sacrificed him. Later, he was married to a woman chosen for him by his father, and eventually duped by her in favor of her favorite son. The big step forward in Isaac's story was the comment that he sowed seed. And so they were beginning to be farmers. Oh, more trouble ahead. Fertility gods, and much more to come. At this point, my 15-year-old pupils of long ago would sort of shiver with excitement and look forward to the next lesson. But Genesis 24 tells the delightful story of aged Abraham sending his servant back to Haran to find a suitable wife for Isaac. The servant went, and the story is told as if in the servant's own words, laden with gifts for the right girl, and off he went to Haran. But he stopped outside the well, where all the girls came out at sunset to draw water. And one beauty in the crowd came to the stranger and offered him water, not only for him, but also for his camel. When the servant discovered that she was related to Abraham's family, he gave her a few gifts from his luggage, and she invited him to meet her brother Laban. The marriage deal was made, and Rebekah eagerly set out to meet her new husband. On return to Canaan, Rebekah was installed in Sarah's tent, and Isaac was comforted following his mother's death. They had twin sons, Esau the older, and Jacob. Now, Jacob was at first an unsavory, nasty, slippery trickster, beloved by all good storytellers. He was not an outdoor huntsman like his brother Esau, but a stay-at-home lad who became his mother's favorite. And when one day Esau had been out all day, he arrived home famished and was met with the smell of a delicious stew that Jacob had cooked. He begged for some and agreed to anything Esau wanted. Jacob claimed his brother's birthright. And Jacob flippantly agreed. Sorry, I've got those muddled, haven't I? Jacob claimed his brother's birthright, and Esau flippantly agreed because he was so hungry. More trouble to come. But all was fine for many years, and the time came eventually when Isaac had grown old and blind, and he decided it was time to put his affairs in order before he died. He decided there should be a ceremonial meal, hunted, caught, and cooked with his favorite recipe by Esau. And so Esau was sent off on his mission. But Rebekah had been listening from her side of the tent. And suddenly she decided to act in favor of her favorite son Jacob. Her plan of action was speedily put into action. In fact, in less time than it would take Esau to return with his hunt, in spite of Jacob saying it wouldn't work. But Rebekah thought of everything. How to pass off her favorite son as his elder brother. And Jacob, very meekly, merely did as instructed. He brought into the tent 2 calves from the home flock, which his mother prepared and cooked as old Isaac liked. She gave Jacob some of Esau's clothes and told him to put them on. And then she took some of the animal's soft, fairy skins and placed them on his smooth arms and neck. And she then sent him in to his father, pretending to be Esau, with the meal that old Isaac was anticipating. Well, old Isaac was blind, but not senile. And first, he expressed his surprise that Esau had succeeded so quickly, but was nevertheless delighted. He was, however, somewhat puzzled. He was hearing Jacob's voice. But the person in front of him felt like Esau, with his hairy arms and neck. Isaac enjoyed his meal, however, and the time eventually came for the climax of the day. He asked his son to kiss him, and he smelt Esau's clothes. So with confidence pronounced his formal blessing, which was the equivalent of a formal last will and testament and probate all at the same time. And all was done and dusted. And then Esau returned. When he took his meal into his father, Isaac could only ask, "Who are you?" And he and Esau suddenly realized what had happened. What distress. There was no going back. A spoken formal blessing was in those days the same as a signed and witnessed document in our time. They were both furious but helpless. Rebekah swiftly sent Jacob away, far away, for safety, back to her brother Laban in faraway Haran. Esau then also left home to become a great fighter with a sword. He didn't, however, catch up with his brother, who lived to experience the next part of the story. Jacob lay down to sleep on his journey and had a dream. Remember the importance of a dream? He had what is now called a theophany. That's a technical word, but it has a meaning. It is a momentary religious experience of being suddenly aware of the presence of God around you. We shall meet this often in this course, so I'll tell you a little more about it. A theophany. It's a phenomenon that belongs to sacred history. It was studied and explored about 50 years ago in the 1970s by two scientists, both zoologists, Alistair Hardy and David Hay, whose specialism was to study the human animal. They advertised a request in the Times and the Daily Telegraph one day, asking people to respond and admit if they had ever experienced a rare and unforgettable moment when they were suddenly aware of being in the presence of the divine creator. The response was overwhelming from all sorts of people, many of whom would not describe themselves as religious, but describing an unusual shiver, a happy shiver, as they sat gazing at a beautiful sunset, for example. It was either an unusual shiver or it was a feeling of great warmth coming over them momentarily. Well, this research is still going on. It's now incorporated into the Religious Experience Research Centre at Manchester College in Oxford. So, Jacob dreamed. And he dreamt and saw a ladder set up on earth, the top of it reaching to heaven, the dreamland. And the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. He felt convinced that his father's blessing was valid and that he had slept on holy ground. To commemorate the place, he renamed it Beth El, the house of God. And this was in the middle of Canaan. It eventually became the center where all his stories were collected and treasured. But in the story, he continued on his journey. And in similar style as before, in the story of Isaac, he met Laban's beautiful daughter Rachel. She was watering her father's sheep at the well. He was invited home to a rapturous welcome from Laban and stayed for a month, helping out with the flock. When Laban wanted to pay him his wages, Jacob admitted that he wanted to marry Rachel. So it was agreed that in his present state of poverty, he would work for 7 years without payment and then receive her as his wife. Laban, however, was as wily as his sister Rebekah. And at the end of 7 years, after the wedding, Jacob unveiled his bride, only to find he'd married Rachel's sister, Leah. The trickster had himself been tricked. And do I hear you crying, hooray? Well, Laban then insisted on another 7 years before he could marry Rachel. And eventually, after all this time, Jacob had 2 wives, with children from Leah, the eldest one being Reuben, but only one called Joseph from Rachel. Joseph started to plan his return to Canaan and his father's fortune that awaited him there. Laban agreed that Jacob should have some of the flock he had cared for so long. Any rare speckled animals among the pure black and white flocks belonging to Laban. Now the trickster wreaked his revenge on his father-in-law. With the help of mandrakes, we read, which were fertility gods, he mixed up the flocks at breeding time, and eventually there were lots of speckled young animals. Relations were very strained, to put it mildly. So Jacob secretly planned his departure while Laban was away from home. All was ready to go, but unknown to Jacob, his much-loved Rachel stole the family gods of her father. Laban was panic-stricken when he returned and found they'd all left. In his anger, he gathered a retinue and pursued Jacob until he caught up with him. Because remember, traveling with tents and animals was a slow progress. After the niceties of regretting that he'd been unable to give them a proper send-off, Laban's righteous anger burst out, not about the secrecy, but with the angry question, "Why did you steal my gods?" In his ignorance, Jacob had no idea that Rachel had hidden them. She'd put them under the saddle of her camel. Jacob swore death to the guilty person if he could find him, if Laban could find him. The tensions rose while Laban's men searched all the luggage, then all the tents of Jacob and the people with him. Finally, there was only one final option: Rachel. She, however, sitting on her camel, refused to move. She claimed it was the time of her menstrual period, which in those days meant she was unclean and untouchable. So Laban was thwarted. He made for departure by setting up a boundary pillar of stones to separate their territories from each other in future. So with relief, the danger was over. They parted company, and Jacob went on his way back home. But was Esau still there, waiting for his revenge? More danger? Jacob sent messengers ahead to tell Esau he was returning, but they returned to tell him that Esau was already coming with a large army of 400 men. So Jacob hastily separated all the women and children and sent them a little way away for safety, while he prayed to the shield of Abraham and the fear of Isaac. He then wisely sent lots of cattle and sheep ahead with servants to deliver them as gifts for Esau. And meanwhile, one night, he went out to the ford at the river Jabbok, which flows into the Jordan, where we're told a man wrestled with him all night until daybreak. This was another dream, another theophany. When in the morning Jacob had survived, a mysterious man said Jacob's name was to be changed to Israel, because he had striven with God and had prevailed. When Jacob, now Israel, asked the name of the God with whom he'd wrestled, he was given no answer, and therefore very humbled. A new experience for the trickster. He named the place Peniel, a place of a god. So Jacob left with a new name, a permanent limp that he would never forget, and now it seemed he was a changed man. But still, he had yet to meet Esau. But in the end, all was well. Time had worked its healing. Esau had himself grown rich and was ready to welcome Jacob back. He accepted the gifts of cattle, and they went their separate ways in peace. Jacob finally arrived back at Bethel, where his God told him his name. I am God Almighty. So, have we now three gods? The shield of Abraham, the fear of Isaac, and the Almighty of Jacob, now Israel. If this was so, then we have to thank the storytellers of the Bible for skillfully combining them all eventually into one. Tragedy struck again with Jacob when Rachel gave birth to a second son, Benjamin, and then died. Jacob was heartbroken. He set up a huge stone in her memory, and it's still known today as Rachel's tomb near Bethlehem. Jacob bought a house at Shechem, where the 10 sons of Leah and the 2 sons of Rachel grew up. And now we can move on to Genesis 37 and the story of Joseph, who was not strictly a patriarch, but essential to the biblical story. His story begins in Genesis 37, but it's very muddled. It seems that 2 separate stories have been woven together, skillfully, but not perfectly, leaving us with several questions. Scholars during the last 200 years in Europe, or it all started in Europe, it has spread since then, have pulled these stories apart, realizing that one story talks of God, G-O-D, but the other refers to him as Lord. And when you read that word Lord in the book of Genesis, it's always printed with capital letters, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. And when you do that, the anomalies begin to disappear. In one version, Joseph's brothers became jealous because Jacob had given him a long-sleeved coat, signifying that he was not to do any menial work like his brothers. The other story tells of Joseph's dreams, in which his brothers bowed down to him. When Joseph eventually took provisions from their father to them when they were looking after his flocks, Joseph was seized by his brothers and thrown into a pit to be left to die. But he didn't. He was rescued. But was it by Reuben or Judah? You take your pick. Was he sold to the Midianites or to the Ishmaelites? I'm going to show you a story of my Bible, my study Bible from long ago. It's on the table for you to look at afterwards. Can you vaguely see that I've used my coloured pencils there? There are huge blobs of green, huge blobs of purple, and one little bit at the first verse in red. And that's what it looks like if you separate the two stories. Let's go on. In this slide, I have separated the two stories, one on the left-hand side, one on the right-hand side. And there are handouts of those for you to take home with you. Let's go back to the coloured one. The coloured one, there's nothing special about the colours I chose for them, except that they would contrast each other. But all through the first part of my Bible, I have coloured in lots and lots of passages in green and lots in purple, lots and lots and lots in red, and eventually the heavy hand of the Deuteronomist, which is coloured black. Not much black in the early chapters of these stories. What it looks like, and scholars are pretty confident now, those two chunks of stories, the green and the purple, come from different parts of Israel. The green bit is considered to be the older one and tells the story of the southern tribes based on Hebron, Abraham's basic city. And it tells the story of the southern tribes. We call it the J code. Now, I remember J because it's near Jerusalem, and that's going to matter quite a lot in the future. The purple, however, comes from the northern tribes, which are north of the Dead Sea and are by far the greater group of people, descendants of Abraham. So the purple ones are the big collection of tribes, the green, the older, but the smaller one near Jerusalem. We're going to come to these two separate types of stories for quite a long time in the Old Testament. But there they are, and they're for you to look at and take to your own Bibles and see that it works. Now, the story of Joseph. It's the longest one in the whole of the Old Testament. It lasts from chapter 39 to 47. And it's a continuous, good bedtime read, providing, of course, that you read from a modern translation. It reads exactly like an historical novel. No surprise, because that's what it is. It even incorporates a well-known Egyptian story of the two brothers and the treacherous wife of one of them. In Genesis, Joseph was bought as a slave by Potiphar, a high-ranking captain of the guard in the court of Pharaoh in Egypt. Joseph served him well and rose in favor until he became the steward of the whole household, and then trouble. Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him and have a fling with him. And there's no fury like a woman scorned. When Joseph remained loyal to his master, the lady then told everyone a different story, how Joseph had tried to seduce her in Potiphar's absence, but that she had resisted. And when Potiphar returned, she told him. And Joseph soon found himself in the royal prison. Once again, he, no doubt his good looks, found favor with the head jailer and was soon in charge of all the other prisoners. And that might have been the end of the story, but no. Sometime later, two royal prisoners were very dejected. They'd each had a dream, but there was no one in the prison who could interpret their dreams, the meanings of the dreams for them. Joseph offered, and told the royal cupbearer that in 3 days' time he would be pardoned and restored to his former position. And when the royal baker heard, he plucked up courage to tell his dream to Joseph, only to hear that in 3 days' time he would be hanged. And 3 days later, on Pharaoh's birthday, it happened, just as Joseph had predicted. The baker died, and the cupbearer once more stood at Pharaoh's side. But the cupbearer completely forgot about Joseph. And another 2 years went by, when suddenly the Pharaoh himself had some troubling dreams, which none of his wise men could interpret. Then the cupbearer suddenly remembered the man in the jail. So Joseph was sent for, he was cleaned up, made presentable, given fresh clothes, and then delivered to the Pharaoh, who told him of his dream. The dream was about fat cows and thin cows, and the fat cows eating up all the thin cows. Joseph told Pharaoh that the 7 fat cows represented 7 years of bountiful harvests, to be followed by 7 thin years of very poor failed crops and eventual famine. Joseph advised Pharaoh to organize huge barns in Egypt within which to store the bountiful harvests, and then they would survive any famine during the lean years. Joseph got the job. No more prison, but minister for food. And with all the luxurious perks, including the gift of a wife, to go with the job. The years of famine arrived extensively, not only over Egypt, but with all the surrounding lands as well, including Canaan. Joseph began to sell grain from the huge reserves he had gathered to the Egyptians, but news traveled. There was corn in Egypt, and that's where the saying comes from, and many travelers came to buy. In Canaan, Jacob sent his 10 sons to Egypt, keeping his beloved Benjamin at home. On arrival, Joseph recognized his brothers, but they had no idea who he was. The novel then moves into a detailed sequence of events in which Joseph played cat and mouse with his brothers, frightening them when they found all their money returned in the sacks that they had bought. And on their next visit, were tricked into persuading Jacob to send Benjamin as a hostage. Then on their 3rd visit, they couldn't understand why they were being treated as special guests. But on their journey home, they were followed and found to have taken Joseph's silver cup. And what's more, it was hidden in Benjamin's luggage. And they thought there was no hope for them. However, at this point, Joseph relented and revealed himself as the brother that they had sold into slavery. And it all ended happily, with Pharaoh inviting Jacob and all his family to migrate and live in Egypt. And they did. They survived the years of famine, and Jacob in his old age met and rejoiced in Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And we're left to presume that they all lived happily ever after. And the book of Genesis comes to an end. And so we come to the end of the patriarchal stories of Abraham. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but with only 2 tenuous hooks to set them into history, and both, if you remember from last time, belonging to Abraham. Do you remember when Abraham migrated from Ur and his acceptance of the law of Hammurabi? That's one hook. and the fact that he came from Ur is the other. There are none for the stories of Isaac or Jacob. In essence, however, these stories are full of theological significance. They give us a long, slow prelude to all that comes next, building on the promises made to Abraham by his God, ready to culminate in the important stories that follow in Exodus. It's a whole book of promise, and it lays the foundation of the nation of Israel and its God, whose character is to care for and guide his chosen people. Joseph is not a patriarch, but the inclusion of his story provides a bridge between the settlers in Canaan and the slaves in Egypt, whom we shall meet next time. It is interesting to note, however, how complementary the Joseph story is to the traditional enemy in Egypt. This may be, thanks to King Solomon many years later. He had been flattered when granted the privilege of marrying an Egyptian princess. And it was during his reign that the scholarly priests and tribes of the newly conquered Jerusalem temple began to collect and commit to writing for the first time these tribal stories of the ancestors, the patriarchs. And so we come to the end of this session with the news that we meet not in 2 weeks' time, but next week here, the 7th of November. And I look forward to seeing you then, or if not, I commend you to watch on the website or the whatever it is. Anyway, thank you for coming. I have enjoyed telling these stories again, as I always do, and I hope you've enjoyed them. Do come and look at my Bible and pick up the notes from this session and the analysis of Genesis 37 to take away, and hope you've enjoyed it. Good night.